Director, Haynes, I want to start with where you ended up on 702. This critical component of both law enforcement and the intelligence community expires on April 19th. Congress needs to act. 60% of all the information that goes into the president's daily brief is derived from 702 information, foreigner talking to foreigner in terms of bad guys. One of the things that the Vice Chairman and I are very proud of is we worked very hard on a reform of Section 702 that we introduced last year, including 16 co-sponsors. A great number of members of this committee are part of that reform effort that, again, looked at trying to make sure where there had been perhaps overzealous use at the FBI in terms of who was queried and how things were queried have been dramatically constrained. Director Wray, I want to start my question, though, with you. Some have actually said, though, that where we went didn't go far enough, and they would propose a reform that would require agencies to seek a warrant before conducting U.S. person queries. Could you explain what would happen on a practical level, both from the IC side and the law enforcement side, if that requirement was put in place?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the short answer is that a warrant requirement for us to run U.S. person queries would be untenable and would largely gut the effectiveness of the authority. And I say that for several reasons. First, it would blind us to information already lawfully in our possession that we need to be able to review and act on in a very time-sensitive way to be able to stop terrorist attacks, protect the victim from a cyber attack, warn somebody who is potentially targeted with assassination or kidnapping. Second, in many instances, at the time that the query would be run, we wouldn't have the probable cause that the query term is associated with an agent of a foreign power. That's what the query tells us. And so you got that problem. And then the third problem is that an awful lot of the places that we're using 702 queries are to assist victims and to prevent potential victims from further attacks, whether terrorist attacks, cyber attacks, et cetera. And so in those instances, you'd never be able to get a warrant requirement. Even if there were some kind of delay built into it, that alone, for all these threats, which are extremely time sensitive, I think the DNI correctly used the term agility. That is the key. And so I would implore Congress not to take that additional step. You mentioned the compliance failures. I've been very clear that the compliance failures that occurred at the FBI are wholly unacceptable, and that's why I put in place a whole host of reforms, which are covering everything from training to our systems, approvals, oversight, an Office of Internal Audit. I could go on, and those reforms are working. The FISA court itself most recently found 98% compliance and commented on the reforms working. The most recent Justice Department report found the reforms working, 99% compliance. And so I think legislation that ensures those reforms stay in place, but also preserves the agility and the utility of the tools, what we need to be able to protect the American people.
Well, I appreciate that, and I do think our reform bill had the notion of trust but verify, so that we would literally legislate the reforms that have been put in place, add a few others, add some of the additional amicus provisions. We also, one of the things I think that have been discovered, that the majority of the queries that involve Americans are actually on victim notification. The very notion of having a warrant to have a victim notification is contradictory in itself. I want to raise another issue that's been, I think that's been appropriately raised, and this is the question around, bulk purchase of personal data. I think we need to go much further on data protection, and I think that has been a failure of this Congress to address in its past. Director Haynes, I know you've done a study on this, and my fear is that some of the proposed reforms would actually not limit foreign entities from obtaining this data, but would limit law enforcement. Can you talk to the question of bulk data purchases and data brokers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think From our perspective, commercially available information, as we sort of think about the entire set of what's out there and what's been discussed in Congress in relation to this, is just increasingly critical to the intelligence community's work. And I think, sort of an obvious example of this is commercial imagery and the role that it played, for example, in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. But there's a whole series of other areas where we're purchasing information, such as commercial threat information that's related to cyber security and things like that. And at the same time, we recognize that commercially available information raises new and important issues related to privacy and civil liberties. And this is in large part true because, more of our daily lives are connected digitally to the world today than ever before. And an increasing amount of data about individuals and their activities, often perceived as not especially sensitive on its own, is actually available for sale alongside increasingly sophisticated analytic tools that essentially, relying on artificial intelligence can actually, in aggregate, raise significant privacy and civil liberties issues that are relevant, which is why we basically said, look, we recognize this is something that is of concern, and we want to make sure that we're actually addressing this issue appropriately and responsibly within the intelligence community. So we had a panel, an external panel, look at this question and really asked them, how and under what circumstances should we use commercially available information, and in particular to reflect on the existing framework for privacy and civil liberties. We've published that report, and in fact, Senator Wyden asked us to, and as a consequence, put that out. And as an intelligence community in our XCOM, as we call it, all the heads together, agreed that we thought those recommendations made sense, and we have issued IC guidance basically for cataloging commercially available information acquired by IC elements to ensure that our handling of such information is consistent with relevant legal policy security considerations to facilitate oversight. And we've developed a framework that augments each IC's elements, Attorney General guidelines and related policies with general principles and additional guidance on how IC elements should access, collect, process commercially available information, including more precise guidance for identifying and dealing with categories of information that pose a greater risk of implicating privacy and civil liberty concerns. And finally, as the panel recommended also, the framework sets out standards and procedures that govern and require periodic reevaluation and acquisition and use decisions. And I think the challenge that is posed by some of the legislative proposals that I've seen require, for example, again, a sort of probable cause requirement before you can obtain that information. Similarly, we are not going to have, in the scenario of, for example, getting cyber threat information commercially, a probable cause reason for getting that. What we're trying to do is understand what the vulnerabilities are, and then what we recognize is that whatever the commercial information is that we're obtaining, we need to treat it in a way that actually mitigates against the risks that have been described.
Thank you. Senator Rubio.